The snow came early to Copper Hollow that October, the kind that settled in hard and didn't apologize for itself. Nessa Drummond stood at her husband's grave with mud on the hem of her black dress, and a cold she couldn't feel anymore. Watching the minister rush through words, he'd said so many times they'd lost all their edges. Henry Vail, beloved husband and father, laid to rest in ground that had been frozen since the first week of the month. The service lasted 12 minutes, she counted. The mourners filed past her afterward with their casseroles and their condolences, and every one of them looked at her the same way. Not unkind, just waiting. She was 28 years old, and she'd been in Copper Hollow for 3 years. Arrived as Henry's mail-order bride from a boarding house in Halifax, where she'd been stretching $2 a week into 3 meals a day. She hadn't loved Henry, not the way the minister implied, but she'd respected him. He'd been a fair man, a quiet man, and he'd treated her like a person, which was more than she'd expected. She was still standing at the grave when Douglas Vail arrived. He came from the direction of the main house, not from town, which meant he'd been waiting. Nessa watched him cross the frost-hard field with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes already calculating, and she understood then what everyone else had already known before the service started. Douglas Vail was Henry's older brother, and he'd driven 11 hours from Medicine Hat the moment the telegram reached him. Nessa. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to be polite about it. I'm sorry for your loss. She didn't answer. The field was emptying out, people returning to their wagons and their warm kitchens, and she had the sudden awareness that she was the last one standing in it. We need to talk about the property, Douglas said. When you're ready. I'm ready now. She wasn't, but she'd learned early that waiting for readiness was a luxury that women in her situation couldn't afford. The Vail family lawyer was a man named Birch, who wore his suit like he'd borrowed it from someone smaller. He had papers spread across Henry's kitchen table before they'd even sat down, and he spoke in the flat voice of a man who considered grief to be an administrative inconvenience. The Vail property, 460 acres, the main house, the outbuildings, the cattle, had been purchased by Henry and Douglas jointly 20 years ago before Nessa had entered the picture. Henry's share passed to his estate. His estate, Birch explained carefully, meant Nessa as his legal widow. Except, the word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Except there was a secondary document drawn up 8 years ago, which gave Douglas Vail the right of first purchase on his brother's share at assessed value, to be exercised within 60 days of Henry's death. And the assessed value, Birch continued, was $600, which Douglas was prepared to offer. Today, if she liked. Nessa looked at the papers. $600 for what was, by any honest measure, a $2,000 share of working land. What if I don't sell? Douglas's chair creaked. He was a large man, broader than Henry had been, with the kind of size that had always read to her as threat rather than strength. Then we co-own the property, he said pleasantly, which becomes complicated for everyone. Birch folded his hands. Practically speaking, Mrs. Vail, a widow managing co-owned agricultural property presents a number of challenges. I've been managing this property for 3 years. Henry's health wasn't good, of course. Birch's smile didn't reach past his teeth. But without full ownership, you'd be unable to make decisions about the cattle contracts, the lease agreements, the equipment. Every significant choice would require Mr. Vail's consent. He paused. It would be quite difficult. You're describing the situation you created, Nessa said, not the one that existed before this document appeared. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Douglas's jaw moved, just slightly, before settling back into something neutral. $600 is a fair offer, he said. You came here with nothing. She had. That was the thing he knew, and she couldn't argue. She'd arrived in Copper Hollow with a single trunk and a letter of introduction from a Halifax minister who hadn't met her in person. Everything she had now, she'd built in this house, on this land, through 3 years of work that nobody had put a number on because it had been wife work, which was the kind of work that only became visible when it stopped getting done. I'll need time to consider, she said. Douglas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Of course, take a week, he said it generously, like a week was a gift. The town of Copper Hollow, population 600 and steadily shrinking, had opinions about what Nessa ought to do, and they were not shy about sharing them, Mrs. Aldersham at the dry goods store expressed sympathy while managing to convey that a woman alone on that much land was an untenable situation. The minister's wife suggested that Douglas Vail was a known man, a respected man, and surely Nessa could see the practical wisdom in settling things simply. Even Meg Forsyth, who'd been the closest thing Nessa had to a friend in the 3 years since she'd arrived, sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, carefully, that $600 was more than some women ever saw. What nobody said directly, but everyone implied. You don't have the standing to refuse. She wasn't from here. She had no family within 2,000 kilometers. Henry was dead, and with him went the only person in Copper Hollow who'd vouched for her arrival in the first place. She was, in the particular arithmetic of small towns in 1889, a woman without a claim except for the legal one she was sitting on, which was the only reason anyone was talking to her at all. On the fourth day after the funeral, she rode the fence line on the east pasture the way Henry had taught her, checking for breaks where the cattle would push through come spring. The morning was still and cold, and the land looked exactly like itself, neither generous nor cruel, just present, waiting to see what she'd do with it. She was at the far corner when she noticed the man fixing the post she'd already noted needed fixing. He was working with the quiet efficiency of someone who didn't need to prove the work was happening. Not one of her hands, she only had two, and she knew their shapes. This man was taller, broader across the shoulders, with a hat pulled low against the wind. He had a horse tied to the fence line 30 feet away, loaded with tools. "That's my fence," Nessa said. He looked up. He had a weathered face, the kind that had spent more time outside than in, and eyes that were darker than she'd expected. He might have been 35, might have been 40. It was hard to tell with men who lived the way he appeared to live. "I know," he said. "Post was loose. Figured I'd save you the trip. I was already making the trip. Fair enough." He didn't apologize, just went back to the post. "Name's Calloway. I worked for your husband 2 summers ago. Short contract." Heard he passed. Amos Calloway? That's right. Henry had mentioned him once, the previous winter, in the context of saying he'd done good work and hadn't caused any trouble, which was Henry's highest praise for anyone. "Why are you here?" she asked. Calloway set the post driver down and looked at her with the same directness she'd tried to use in the lawyer's office. "Because Douglas Vail is telling people you're going to sell inside the week, and I've seen what happens to property when he gets his hands on it. There was a widow in Pincher Creek 5 years ago. He bought her land for a third of what it was worth and had her out of the county before the month was done." He picked up the driver again. "I thought you might want to know." Nessa sat on her horse and considered him. "Why do you care?" He was quiet for a moment. Just the sound of metal against frozen earth. "My mother was a widow," he said finally. "She held land in Saskatchewan for 6 years after my father died. Fought for every acre. Eventually lost most of it anyway, but not because she didn't try." He glanced up. "I should have helped her more than I did. Figured I'd stop making the same mistake." It wasn't a comfortable thing to say. He said it like someone who'd been turning it over for a long time and was past the point of making it sound better than it was. "The post looks solid," Nessa said. "Should hold through spring. Come to the house after. I'll make coffee." Calloway told her things over that kitchen table that she'd been piecing together on her own, but hadn't been able to confirm. Douglas Vail had done this before, not always with family, but with adjacent landowners, with creditors, with anyone who found themselves holding something valuable without the resources to defend it. He understood systems, Douglas did. He understood that a woman alone in 1889 in a town where she had no roots was legally vulnerable in ways she might not even be fully aware of. "The 60-day clause," Calloway said. "Do you know when it starts?" "Date of death. October 7th, which gives you until just before Christmas." He drank his coffee black, both hands around the cup. "He's trying to push you to decide before you can get proper legal advice from outside the county. Birch is the only lawyer in Copper Hollow. There's a man in Lethbridge named Quincy who doesn't owe anything to the Vail family. But getting to Lethbridge in this weather." He let the sentence finish itself. Nessa understood. She'd priced out the journey already in her head. The roads were bad and getting worse. She had 2 horses, both of which she needed for the daily work of the property. And the train didn't run to Lethbridge in the winter on any schedule she could count on. "He's already cut off the feed account," she said, "at Hargreaves. Told them the property finances were under review pending estate settlement." Calloway's expression didn't change, but something in it went flat. "When?" 2 days ago. "I found out when I tried to order bales. That's not legal. Tell that to Hargreaves." He and Douglas went to school together. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the wind was picking up, throwing sleet against the north window. Nessa had split the last of the inside firewood that morning and hadn't had time to bring more in. These were the calculations that filled her days now. What was running out, what would run out next, what could wait and what absolutely couldn't. "I can help," Calloway said, "if you want it, not charity. I'll work for fair wages, same as I did for Henry. You keep the accounts, you make the decisions. I don't tell you what to do." "Why would you do that when Douglas is probably offering you better money to do the opposite?" "He offered me $100 to report back on your plans." The directness of it was almost shocking. "I told him I'd think about it, and then I came here instead." Nessa set down her cup. "He knows you're here. He knows I rode out this way. He doesn't know I'm inside drinking your coffee. A very faint thing crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though I wouldn't count on that lasting. It was not a comfortable position to be in, taking help from a man she'd known for less than an hour in a situation where trust was exactly the thing that kept getting weaponized against her. She was aware of this. She was also aware that the wood needed bringing in, that the feed account was blocked, that the fence line had 3 more posts she'd noticed wobbling, and that Douglas Vail had apparently already made inquiries at the bank about her personal account. She had the land. She had the legal right for now. What she didn't have was time to manage it all alone. Wages same as Henry paid, she said. I keep the accounts. You consult me before you do anything that costs more than $10. Done. And if Douglas approaches you again, you'll be the first to know. She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away, didn't soften it into something easier. He just waited. Fine, she said. Bring the firewood in before dark. The 6 days that followed were the kind of work that didn't leave room for much else. Calloway fixed what needed fixing, without being asked, and didn't fix anything that didn't, which was rarer than it sounded. He slept in the bunkhouse with the other 2 hands and ate with them, and he had a quality she'd noticed in a particular kind of person. He was quiet without being sullen, present without being pushy. He did the work and let it speak. Douglas came on the 5th day. He arrived mid-morning with Birch and 2 of his own men from Medicine Hat, which struck Nessa as a show of something. She wasn't sure if it was confidence or nerves. She was in the yard when they rode up, and she stood her ground in it, which she'd decided she was going to do regardless of how it felt. Because how it felt and what she did about it were 2 different things. Nessa. Douglas dismounted. His eyes went past her to the bunkhouse, then back. I see you've hired on. I had a fence to fix, Calloway. He said the name like he was identifying something unpleasant. Interesting choice, he came recommended. She kept her voice even. What can I do for you, Douglas? He smiled. He had Henry's features, but they sat differently on him. The same jaw, the same broad forehead, but the set of them was harder. I thought we could talk about the offer. You've had 5 days. You said a week. I'm giving you the opportunity to settle it sooner. Before the situation gets more complicated. What situation would that be? Birch cleared his throat. Mrs. Vail, there are a number of outstanding questions about the estate accounts that need to be resolved before. The accounts are fine. Nessa had spent 2 nights going through every ledger Henry had kept, and she was right about this. I've maintained them for 3 years. There are no outstanding questions unless you're creating them. Douglas's pleasantness developed a crack in it, just small. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making it anything. You're trying to buy land for 1/3 of its value, and you're frustrated that I'm not agreeing quickly enough. She met his eyes. The offer is low. You know it's low. I know it's low. The actual question is whether you think I'm too isolated to say so. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't tell if it was anger or something closer to surprise. You have until Sunday, he said, and it came out harder than it had before. After that, I'll be pursuing the co-ownership option, which will tie up the property in legal proceedings for years. Then it will be tied up, she said. Good morning, Douglas. She watched him go. Birch gave her a look over his shoulder that was almost pitying. The 2 men from Medicine Hat didn't look at her at all. Calloway appeared at her elbow as the wagon rounded the far bend. That went well, he said dryly. I bought time. You also made him angry. He was already angry. I just made it visible. She turned back to the house. What does he actually want? Calloway was quiet for a moment. The road, he said finally. The rail company's been surveying through this county. The easiest route to Lethbridge runs along the east edge of the Vail property, the section Henry owned. Nessa stopped walking. A rail easement, worth 5 times what he's offering you for the whole share. She stood still in the cold for a moment, the wind pulling at her coat. All of it, the rush, the blocked accounts, Birch's paperwork, the week's deadline. It assembled itself into a shape she could finally read. He needs to own it clean, she said. He can't sell a rail easement on co-owned land without my consent. That's my read. And Birch helped him structure the original document to get first purchase rights. 8 years ago. Before Henry married you. Before the surveying started. She looked at the fence line, at the east pasture Calloway had fixed that first morning, at the land that ran right along the route he was describing. Get to Lethbridge, she said. Whatever it takes. Find Quincy. Calloway left before dawn the next morning, and Nessa didn't hear from him for 4 days, which were the longest 4 days she'd experienced since arriving in Copper Hollow. She ran the property alone with the 2 hands, managed the cattle, brought in what wood she could, and every morning checked the road for riders coming from the wrong direction. Douglas sent a man on the third day, not to speak to her but just to be seen. A hired hand who sat his horse at the edge of her property line for 2 hours in the cold and then left. She understood the message. She pretended not to have received it. On the fourth night, Calloway came back with a letter from the lawyer in Lethbridge. He came to the back door well after dark, and she was already awake. She'd developed the habit of sleeping lightly since Henry died. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the awareness that being surprised in this situation would cost her. He looked like he'd slept roughly, which he probably had. She put coffee on without asking. The letter was 3 pages, dense with legal language, and it said several things that made her set it down and pick it up again. The 60-day clause, Quincy believed, had procedural problems. It had been witnessed by the same notary who handled all of the Vail family business, which created a conflict the courts had ruled on in similar cases. Not a certainty, but an argument. More importantly, the property assessment used to establish the $600 offer was 5 years old, and the value had changed substantially, partly due to the surveying activity Douglas himself would have been aware of. Using a stale assessment in a first purchase clause was, in Quincy's opinion, actionable. None of this was a guarantee. All of it was a fighting chance. "He'll escalate," Calloway said. He was reading the letter over her shoulder, which she'd normally have had something to say about, except that she'd stopped having the energy for normal. "I know. When he finds out you've contacted outside counsel, which he'll know by morning once Birch hears about it through his brother-in-law who works at the Lethbridge, I know." She folded the letter. "What would you do?" He was quiet for a moment, not hedging, just actually thinking about it. "I'd contact the rail company directly," he said. "Not as leverage, not as a threat, just to make sure they know the easement situation is contested. They don't want to buy into a legal mess. If they know the east parcels have a dispute attached, they'll wait it out rather than deal with Douglas until it's resolved. That takes the urgency off his side and puts it back on his." She looked at him. He was still holding his coffee cup both hands, the same way he'd sat at this table the first day. It struck her suddenly that she didn't actually know much about him. Where he'd been before Copper Hollow, where he'd go after, what he had to gain or lose from any of this. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked, genuinely. "Not the explanation you gave about your mother, which I think is true, but isn't the whole of it." He took a long breath. He looked, for the first time, like the question had cost him something to receive. "There was a woman," he said, "in a situation like this. Not exactly like this, but close enough. She had a small piece of land in the Alberta foothills that a larger operator wanted. She asked me to help her, and I said I had my own problems and moved on." He set the cup down. "She lost everything. Ended up in a rooming house in Calgary, taking in sewing. Last I heard, when was this? 4 years ago. You've been carrying that for 4 years. I've been managing it. There's a difference." He met her eyes, and his were steady, not soft. "I don't need you to feel sorry for me about it. I need you to know I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. That's all." She didn't feel sorry for him. She felt, if anything, that she understood him in the way you understood something that had been worn down to its actual shape by difficulty. Not pretty, but honest. "The rail company office," she said. "Is that in Lethbridge?" "Calgary. But I can send a telegram. Send it in the morning. Use my name and Henry's, both on the property." He nodded. Then he picked up his cup, drained it, and stood. "I'll let you sleep," he said. "You look like you need it more than I do." That almost smile again, brief and contained. "Probably." He moved to the door, stopped. "For what it's worth, and I recognize it might not be worth much, I think you're going to keep this land." It was not a comfortable thing to say, because neither of them could be certain it was true. She appreciated that he said it anyway. "Good night, Calloway," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Vail." Douglas came on a Sunday as he'd promised, with 4 men this time and no pretense of a social call. Nessa was in the yard when they arrived, and she had 2 things Douglas wasn't expecting: the letter from Quincy in her coat pocket, and a man from the Calgary rail office sitting in her kitchen drinking tea. The railman, whose name was Pemberton, had arrived that Saturday after Calloway's telegram prompted a response faster than either of them had anticipated. Pemberton had a careful manner and a careful face, and he'd explained, over the tea she'd made, that the rail company was indeed planning a route through the region, and that they were very interested in speaking with all property owners with land adjacent to the surveyed corridor, directly before any easements were negotiated. He'd said directly with a particular emphasis. She hadn't explained the full situation. She hadn't needed to. Douglas dismounted in the yard with a confidence that faltered when Calloway came out of the bunkhouse and positioned himself at the edge of the scene without being asked. Not aggressive, just there. "Nessa, Sunday." Douglas spread his hands. "Time's up." "Your deadline," she said. "Not mine. I've engaged outside counsel regarding the validity of the 60-day clause. I've also been in conversation with the Calgary and Northern Railway about the easement route through the east parcels. She kept her voice level. If you proceed with the co-ownership dispute, the rail company's timeline becomes uncertain, which I understand affects your financing arrangements with the Merchants Bank in Medicine Hat. She did not know for certain that he had financing arrangements. She was going on Calloway's best guess, which had turned out to be accurate enough to watch Douglas's face do something complicated. Where did you? It's a small province, she said, and people talk. Birch, still on his horse, leaned over and said something in Douglas's ear that she couldn't hear. Douglas's expression shifted through several things before landing somewhere harder and colder than she'd seen it before. You think you're clever, he said. I think the east parcels are mine and the assessed value in your document is 5 years old, and Quincy and Lethbridge is filing a procedural challenge by end of week. She looked at him steadily. I think you should take the time to reconsider your offer. I'm not offering you more money. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to offer a fair price, which is quite different. The standoff lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except, apparently, Calloway, who watched the whole thing with his arms crossed and the expression of someone waiting for a kettle to boil. Douglas wheeled his horse and left without another word, which was the kind of leaving that meant nothing had been decided but the terms had changed. Birch followed, not looking at her. The 4 hired men went last in a cluster, and one of them glanced back at Calloway in a way that suggested the two of them had met before under different circumstances. Pemberton came out of the house as the last rider disappeared. Well, he said mildly, that was brisk. He'll come back, Nessa said. They usually do. Pemberton buttoned his coat. For what it's worth, the company is very interested in a straightforward easement transaction, much simpler than dealing with co-ownership disputes. He handed her a card. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Vail. She watched him go, then stood in the empty yard for a moment. The cold had settled in properly, the kind that sat at the back of your throat when you breathed. Calloway came to stand beside her. Pemberton, he said, you told him. I told him the situation was complicated by a potential dispute over ownership rights. I didn't have to say more than that. She put the card in her coat pocket next to Quincy's letter. He drew his own conclusions. The bank financing, Calloway said. How did you? Meg Forsyth's husband works in Medicine Hat. He mentioned 2 weeks ago that Douglas had taken on significant debt against projected land revenues. She paused. I'd been wondering what he was projecting. Calloway was quiet for a moment. You figured it out before I did. I had more time to sit still and think. She went inside to put more wood on the fire. After a moment, she heard his boots on the steps behind her. The winter was hard in the way that Alberta winters were hard. Not dramatically, not with any particular cruelty, just relentlessly, day after day of cold and work, and the weight of managing something that didn't care about your circumstances. Nessa managed it. Calloway worked the land and she kept the accounts, and they developed over weeks of close quarters and shared difficulty, a way of being around each other that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable exactly, but rather functional in the way that mattered. He didn't push. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He had opinions, clear ones, which he stated plainly when asked and didn't state when he wasn't. And he made decisions within his domain and brought the larger ones to her, consistently without making a performance of either. She'd expected resentment, eventually. She'd had it with the other 2 hands, a low-grade thing she'd pretended not to notice. With Calloway, it didn't come. In February, Quincy won the procedural challenge. The 60-day clause was set aside pending review, which meant Douglas's formal avenue to force the sale was gone for the time being. He could still pursue co-ownership disputes, but the urgency had dissolved. And with it, apparently, some of his resolve. Pemberton had quietly indicated that the rail company was proceeding with easement conversations directly with both current owners, which meant Douglas had to negotiate rather than dictate. The easement came through in March. It was not, Nessa knew, the end of Douglas Vail as a consideration, but it was a line she'd held that she hadn't expected to hold. The morning she signed the easement papers, she sat at the kitchen table afterward for a long time without doing anything else. It was a strange feeling. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter, more like the settling of weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd stopped being able to feel its shape. Calloway was in the barn when she came out. He was doing something to a bridle, the focused, quiet attention he brought to most tasks, and he looked up when she came in. Done? He said, done. He nodded, looked back at the bridle. She stood in the doorway for a moment. You're staying, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. If you'll have me, the wages are the same. The work is the same. I know, she looked at him. He looked at the bridle, and then he looked at her. And the thing that passed between them was honest in the way that only happened between people who had been through something difficult together and had not pretended otherwise. "Spring's coming," she said. "Fence line on the west pasture needs work before then. I noticed. I'll start tomorrow." She went back to the house. The sun was coming in through the north window now in a way that it hadn't for months, the particular thin early spring light that in the prairies always looked a bit like an argument. Tentative, not quite committed, but present. She put the kettle on. A week later, Douglas sent a letter through Birch's office offering $1,200 for the share. Still low, but a different number. She wrote back and told him she'd consider it at $1,800, which was fair. She expected he'd refuse and she was prepared to hold the property indefinitely. She sent the letter and went to check the west fence line, where Calloway was already halfway through the first section, working the same quiet way he did everything, steady and without complaint against the cold. She stopped to help him with a post that needed 2 people to set right. They worked in silence, the kind that had grown comfortable over months without either of them having said so. "He'll counter," Calloway said, driving the post into the loosened ground. "At 1,500, probably. I'll take it." "You'll take 1,500? It's more than he offered in October and less than he should be paying. Which means I've won something without bankrupting him. And men like Douglas Vail are less dangerous when they're not humiliated." She tested the post. It held. "My mother taught me that. She ran a boarding house in Halifax. She said the most important thing was knowing the difference between winning and grinding someone down." Calloway picked up the next post. Smart woman, she was. "Nessa moved to the next hole. She died the year before I came out here. Consumption." "I'm sorry. She would have liked this land," Nessa said. "She was always looking at things and asking what they'd become." They worked through the morning, the kind of work that left her tired in a clean way, and by noon they'd fixed the entire section that had been giving trouble since autumn. The land around them was starting to show something under the snow, the suggestion of color, the first unlocking. Alberta coming back to itself as it always did, in its own time and without asking. Douglas accepted 1,600 in April, which was close enough to fair that she let it stand. The year that followed was not easy. Cattle prices fell in the summer, and she had to sell down the herd further than she'd wanted, which was a loss she spent 2 weeks feeling the weight of before accepting it and moving forward. The roof on the north outbuilding had to be replaced, which took most of what she'd saved from the easement payment. The second hand she'd brought on in the spring quit in June without notice, which left her and Calloway and the other man carrying what should have been 3 people's work. She held it, all of it. By the following October, the second anniversary of Henry's death, the property was smaller than it had been, and less prosperous than she'd hoped, but it was hers, and it was solvent, and it was, she thought, standing at the edge of the east pasture in the same month's cold, something she'd made real rather than something she'd inherited. She'd started corresponding with a woman in Calgary named Ida, who ran a network connecting widows in rural Alberta with legal resources and financial advice, informal, unofficial, the kind of organization that existed because it had to. Nessa had written to her first asking for referrals, and it had turned into something longer. A conversation about the particular ways that women in her situation fell through the gaps of what the law said and what it actually provided. She'd told Calloway about it one evening when the accounts were settled and the kitchen was warm. He'd listened in the way he listened to most things, without interrupting, and when she was done, he'd said that it sounded like work that needed doing. "It might not come to anything," she'd said. "Most things don't until they do." She'd written back to Ida the next morning. By the following spring, she'd connected 6 women to Quincy's office in Lethbridge. By fall, 2 of them had held property they'd expected to lose. Small numbers, but they were numbers. Standing at the fence line now, in October again, she thought about the morning she'd watched Douglas Vail ride away from her yard and known, not with certainty but with something that felt like its close relative, that she wasn't going to let this land go. She'd been afraid then, a constant low-grade fear she'd learned to function inside, like a noise you stopped hearing after long enough. She wasn't afraid now. She was, most days, tired and occupied, and occasionally something she was only recently able to call content, which was a word she'd mistrusted for years, because it had always sounded like settling. It wasn't settling. It was the difference between running from something and running toward something, and she'd learned that distinction the hard way, over a winter that had tried everything it had on her, and found her, to its apparent surprise, still standing at the end of it. Calloway came up beside her. He'd started doing that. Appearing beside her when she was looking at something, not crowding, just present in the way he'd been present through all of it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the east pasture needs a new windbreak before next winter, or we'll lose the fence again." "Probably." He looked at the tree line. "Spruce or poplar?" "Spruce, slower, but it holds." He nodded. They stood there for another moment in the particular Alberta quiet that was never entirely quiet, always wine somewhere, always the land doing something at the edges of hearing. I found some letters, she said, in Henry's desk. He'd written to you, apparently, after the summer you worked here. Asked you to check on me if anything happened to him. Calloway was quiet for a beat. He did. You didn't mention that. Didn't seem useful to mention. It explains why you came. Partly. He looked at her directly. I came because he asked. I stayed because of you. It was a plain thing to say, and he said it plainly, which was, she'd decided, the only way she trusted things said. She'd had enough of elaborate language used to make difficult things sound reasonable. She preferred this, direct without ornamentation, leaving her room to do something with it or not. I know, she said. The sun was low and moving, the way it always was at this latitude in October, throwing long shadows across the pasture she'd held through one of the harder years she'd had. She thought about her mother, asking what things would become. She thought about Ida in Calgary, and the 6 letters she'd sent, and the 2 women who'd kept their land. She thought about Henry, who'd written letters he'd never expected anyone to need, and turned out to be wrong about that, which was perhaps the most useful thing he'd done for her without knowing it. The windbreak, she said. If we start in the spring, it could be established enough by the second winter to make a difference. That's the plan, then. It was not a dramatic thing to say. It was not, in fact, very much of anything except true and forward-looking, which was all she needed it to be. She turned from the fence and walked back toward the house. After a moment, she heard his footsteps in the frost behind her, steady and unhurried, the sound of someone who had nowhere else to be.